Well, welcome to this evening's series. I say series, we only do a couple of these a year, so it's a limited series, a special. Critical conversations today, understanding Crimea. I'm going to give the Laurier land acknowledgement first, and then 2 sentences just to introduce the Waterloo School, although I'm going to guess most people here are quite familiar with it. And then I'll introduce our speakers. I think Ivan will speak first, and Alexander second for about 15 minutes each today. So we would like to acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University and its campuses are located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the District 1 Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict. From the Haldeman Proclamation of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the river, Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. So that's the official Laurier land acknowledgement. Welcome to the Waterloo School. I'm Alistair Edgar. I'm on the Laurier side of the 2 universities here. I'm the Associate Dean. So critical conversations. The Waterloo School of International Affairs, which is now in its 15th year since the program began, at any rate, although the students were based at the 2 universities, has established this as an opportunity to bring in excellent speakers on hot topics, critical topics, as the title says, and invite them to give us their understanding, their knowledge, and to engage with the public, the local community, as well as our own students. And I'm happy to see a range of people here and probably online. Okay. So let me introduce a little bit of our speakers. Ivan John Jaworsky is Professor Emeritus. I've been told to keep these short because they both want them short, so we're all. Ivan John Jaworsky is Professor Emeritus, Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, who retired in 2018. His research interests include dissent and its legacies in the Soviet Union and its successor states, regional issues and inter-ethnic relations in Ukraine, civil military relations in Ukraine, and the politics of ethnicity in Canada. Between 2000 and 2010, he was a research associate with the Building Democracy in Ukraine and Democratic Education in Ukraine projects. Beginning in 1997 and prior to 2013, Professor Jaworsky made numerous trips to Crimea. He's the author of The Military Strategic Significance of Recent Developments in Ukraine and Ukraine Stability and Instability, as well as numerous articles. He's also prepared for publication the memoirs of Ukraine's first Minister of Defense, Kostiantyn Morozov, called Above and Beyond, and of the political prisoner Danylo Shumuk. Alexander Lanoshka is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and at the Waterloo School of International Affairs with the University of Waterloo. He's also Associate Fellow at the UK-based Council on Geostrategy, Senior Fellow at the Ottawa-based Macdonald Laurier Institute, and a Visiting Professor at the College of Europe in Natalin, Poland. His research addresses alliance politics and military strategy with a focus on East Central Europe. Alex has published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as International Security, International Affairs, and Security Studies. He's also co-written policy monographs on Baltic security and Taiwanese defense strategy. His books include Atomic Assurance, The Alliance Politics of Nuclear Proliferation, from Cornell University, and Military Alliances in the 21st Century from Polity in 2022. And this thing says it's moderated by Anne, but Anne is here. So I believe we're going to have Ivan speak first.
Thank you, Alistair. And as a retired professor, I often miss my students, the students I used to have. So for this evening, you'll in a sense be, at least in a certain way, my students. So thank you for coming. And I very much welcome your questions. I hope there will be good questions following our presentations, which will be fairly brief, because we want to encourage discussion, questions, and so on. Now, the main purpose of my presentation is to criticize some of the more common myths, some of the more common stories that surround Crimea, and to provide some useful information that provides a context for Alexander's presentation that follows. Now, before 2014, which is when Crimea was occupied by Russia and then annexed by Russia, it was known to Western observers primarily for two reasons. First is the site of the Crimean War of the 1850s, immortalized in Tennyson's dramatic poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, and also stories about the nurse Florence Nightingale. Those who are of an older generation probably know something about Tennyson's poem and also Florence Nightingale. I remember memorizing parts of The Charge of the Light Brigade, truly a very dramatic poem. And I can't help reciting, into the valley of death rode the 600. There is not to wonder why, there is but to do or die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. It's truly a very interesting poem about an interesting event during the Crimean War of the 1850s. Now, second, in terms of why Crimea is sometimes remembered, it was in Crimea that Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met in February 1945 at what became known as the Yalta Conference, where they discussed the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. Otherwise, however, Crimea and the Black Sea region in general attracted relatively little attention before 2014. And although Crimea was briefly in the headlines after it was occupied and then annexed by Russia in 2014, it is only in recent months, and especially weeks, that Crimea has featured regularly in the news. Still, it is obvious, and we can see this in the map behind us, that Crimea occupies a very strategic location in the Black Sea Basin, and it played, going back many centuries, an important role as a crossroads of sorts. Hence, one finds in Crimea Greek and Roman ruins from the period of antiquity, an impressive Genoese fortress from the time when Crimea was an important transit point on the Great Silk trade route. We find a Crimean Tatar palace in Bakhchisarai, and Tsarist palaces adorning what was often called, during the late Tsarist period, the Crimean Riviera. Now, like all such crossroads, Crimea is a subject of various myths. One such myth is that Crimea is ancestral Russian territory. To quote Vladimir Putin, it has always been an integral part of Russia, end of quote. A rather historically bizarre statement, as I'll try and show. Now, the basis for that particular statement is a story, and it is only a story, that the ruler of the medieval kingdom of Kiev and Rus, Volodymyr the Great, was baptized in Chersonesos in Crimea, and thus, according to Putin, Crimea has and I'm quoting again, has a, quote, sacred and civilizational meaning for Russia, end of quote. Now, first of all, there is considerable controversy over whether this baptism actually took place in Crimea. According to some sources, it actually took place in Kyiv, what is now the capital of Ukraine. Second, the legacy of the kingdom of Kiev and Rus, ruled by Volodymyr, is claimed by Ukraine as well as Russia. And in my opinion, as well as that of many others, Ukraine has a more legitimate claim to this legacy, that is the legacy of Rus or Kiev and Rus. Third, and in my opinion, most important, it is patently ridiculous to justify events taking place in the 21st century with reference to a religious ceremony that may or may not have taken place in Crimea more than 10 centuries earlier. So again, that kind of logic or argument I find rather bizarre. Now, Russia did incorporate Crimea into the Russian Empire in the late 18th century. However, Russians and Ukrainians had a minimal presence in Crimea until the 19th century. From the 13th until well into the 19th century, the largest and dominant population in Crimea consisted of Crimean Tatars. When I am sometimes asked who has the most legitimate claim to Crimea, Russia or Ukraine, I answer that it is actually the Crimean Tatars who have the most legitimate claim to this territory. Apart from a 45-year period when they lived in exile, and this was mostly in Central Asia, after they were forcibly and very brutally deported from Crimea in 1944, the Crimean Tatars had a continuous and dominant presence for many centuries in Crimea, where they had their own statehood. And by the way, after they were deported, and this was collective responsibility, it involved children, senior citizens, many died during the process of deportation. It was truly a very brutal event. But after that period of exile in the late 1980s, they began trickling back, and eventually many did return to their original homeland, Crimea, although many who returned were actually not born there. They were the children or sometimes the grandchildren of those who had been deported. Now, Ukraine has in fact officially recognized the Crimean Tatars as the indigenous population of Crimea. The Ukrainian term is korінне населення, the rooted population of Crimea, together with two other very small minority groups, the Karaites or Karaime, and the Krimchaks or Krimchake. They're also recognized as indigenous populations of Crimea. Now, after the second Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, the Crimean Tatars began returning to Ukraine as soon as this became possible in the late 1980s. They have actually been remarkably loyal to Ukraine. This is not just because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, with Russia serving in the role of a traditional enemy. There are several other reasons for the Crimean Tatar loyalty to Ukraine, such as close ties between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar dissidents during the Soviet period. For example, and I'll just give one example here, when the Crimean Tatars were still living in exile, one of their most consistent supporters was a very interesting Ukrainian dissident and human rights activist. He lived in Moscow at the time, the late Petro Hrigorenko, often known as the Russian form of his name, Pyotr Grigorenko. He was a close friend of the Nobel Prize winner Andrei Sakharov, and he was forcibly detained in a psychiatric institution for quite a few years, primarily because of his activities in defense of the right of Crimean Tatars to return to their homeland. To this day, he is greatly revered in the Crimean Tatar community. But the opposition of the Crimean Tatars to the Russian occupation of Crimea and their loyalty to Ukraine came at a great cost. And the Crimean Tatars have been by far the greatest victims of Russia's repressive policies in Crimea. The Crimean Tatars are a relatively small group. There are roughly 250,000 in Crimea, although quite a few still live in Central Asia, and there is a large Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey. Thus, the arrest and imprisonment of numerous Crimean Tatar activists in recent years has had a dramatic impact on this fairly small community. I would say more about this fascinating group, but my time is limited. Still, a brief but important footnote. In September, just a few weeks ago, Rustem Umerov, a Crimean Tatar, was appointed as Ukraine's new defense minister, the second wartime defense minister in Ukraine. An excellent manager, he is also a very determined advocate of returning Crimea to Ukraine's control. So his appointment is an additional signal from Kyiv, from Ukraine, that Ukraine includes Crimea in its plans to restore the country's full territorial integrity. Now, during the early Soviet period, Crimea was actually officially part of the RSFSR, the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union, and was transferred to the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian SSR, the Ukrainian Republic of the Soviet Union, in 1954. Now, this transfer gave rise to a new set of myths. The most prominent is the myth that Crimea was arbitrarily gifted to Ukraine by the then first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the de facto Communist Party leader, Nikita Khrushchev. The truth is much more prosaic. Again, the myth is that this was a gift that was arbitrarily transferred to Ukraine. The transfer of Crimea from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian Republic, however, was a purely pragmatic move, based on the realization that Ukraine was in a far better position than Russia to promote the revival of Crimea, the economy of which had been devastated by World War II and the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. Ukraine was, after all, linked to the territory of Crimea by a narrow isthmus, that is a piece of land linking Ukraine and Crimea, the rest of Ukraine and Crimea, whereas Russia had no land connection to Crimea. Ukraine was also in a position to provide water to Crimea by means of a canal which diverted water from Ukraine's main river, the Dnipro, and this allowed for the development of agriculture in an otherwise arid region, especially in northern Crimea. And it should also be noted that the transfer of Crimea from the Russian to Ukrainian republics was carried out in full conformity with Soviet legal procedures. You can be critical of Soviet legal procedures in general, but those legal procedures were observed in the actual transfer. Now, I would like to briefly touch on one more myth, the myth of Crimea as an impregnable Russian fortress, a Russian bastion of sorts, with the so-called hero city of Sevastopol playing a central role in this particular myth. Now, as most of you are probably aware, developments of the last few months, and especially recent weeks, have poked great holes in that particular myth of Russia of Crimea as an impregnable bastion fortress. Now, I assume that Alexander will touch on some of those recent developments, so I won't elaborate. But even if Crimea is, in some respects, a rather vulnerable fortress, Russia was able to occupy and annex Crimea in 2014 and engage in its militarization, a very unfortunate militarization. I typically see Crimea as a wonderful territory for tourism, and unfortunately, it's been turned into a military kind of enclave of sorts. But I want to discuss some of the serious errors on the part of the central Ukrainian authorities, since I don't want to leave Ukraine, in a sense, off the hook in terms of some of the developments which took place in 2014 and afterwards. I want to at least briefly address some of Ukraine's mistakes, which greatly contributed to the relatively painless for Russia annexation of Crimea in 2014. First, keep in mind that in 2014, Crimea was the only region of Ukraine with a majority population of ethnic Russians. And well before 2014, Russia had mounted a persistent and consistent propaganda campaign to emphasize that the ethnic Russians living in Crimea were part of a broader Russian world. The Russian term is Ruski Mir. Now, prior to 2014, openly pro-Russia parties in Crimea were fairly weak, partly because of their incompetent leaders. Some of them had links to organized crime. But the audience in Crimea for pro-Russia propaganda was quite large, and Ukraine's response to the propaganda messages coming from Russia were quite feeble and disorganized. Now, another serious mistake was allowing for a large Russian Black Sea fleet presence in the port city of Sevastopol, which is an ideal port, incidentally, for military ships. It's the best port, according to specialists, in the Black Sea for naval ships or for ships in general. Now, Ukraine came under tremendous and unrelenting pressure when the Soviet Union fell apart to permit Russia to maintain a large naval base in Sevastopol. Given Ukraine's weakness in the early 1990s, it was not surprising that Ukraine caved into Russian demands. And in fact, Ukraine's first and very capable defense minister, Kostiantyn Morozov, resigned largely because of this capitulation to Russian demands. But still, once a decision was made to allow for a Russian naval presence in Sevastopol, it's surprising that almost no effective measures were taken by Ukraine to control the activities of Black Sea Fleet personnel outside of the territory of the naval base. It's actually quite normal, whenever one country has a naval base on the territory of another, this always or almost always causes problems, right? But you can attempt to control the activity of personnel on that base, especially when they leave the base. A classic, maybe the most extreme example, the Americans actually have a naval base in Cuba. It's Guantanamo, right? Rather bizarre, a naval base in Cuba. But that base is hermetically closed off from the rest of Cuban territory. And the Cubans do everything possible to ensure that there's no traffic of any kind between the naval base. And I won't go into the whole issue of Guantanamo. It's a very interesting place and a very unfortunate place, but that's an extreme example of how bases are very often hermetically closed off from the territory in which they are found. Now, in contrast, in Sevastopol, Black Sea Fleet personnel moved freely not only throughout the entire city of Sevastopol, but were frequently spotted, often wearing civilian clothing, throughout Crimea as a whole. Not surprisingly, those Black Sea Fleet personnel, Russian Black Sea Fleet personnel, played a significant role in Russia's occupation and then annexation of Crimea in March 2014. Now, another very significant problem was Ukraine's overall approach to Crimea prior to 2014. This approach consisted essentially of fighting fires. That is, Ukraine's central government would engage in frantic efforts to deal with major problems in relations with Crimea after these problems emerged, only to lapse into inaction when the problems went away or appeared to go away. And this is part of a broader problem. Ukraine is a large country. It appears to some to be relatively small, but that's only in comparison to its neighbor, Russia, right? It looks small when you look at a map and see this enormous country of Russia. But it's actually a very large country with substantial regional differences. Prior to 2014, however, Ukraine did little to prepare and implement a coherent and effective policy to deal with the country's regional differences. An anecdotal example to illustrate what I've just said. After one of my early visits to Crimea, I think this is in the late 1990s, I contacted a senior bureaucrat in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, and passed on some of the complaints I had heard from Crimean Tatars about a lack of support from Kyiv for their efforts to reestablish themselves in Crimea. And the problems they faced were truly significant. They were massive. He replied, this bureaucrat, in a tone of tired resignation, that the Crimean Tatars were not really being discriminated against by the authorities in Kyiv. These authorities, he said, were not helping anyone. It wasn't only the Crimean Tatars they were not helping. They weren't particularly helping anyone in Crimea and so on. So the Crimean Tatars, he said, should not feel singled out, that they were being singled out for special attention. It was a cynical but very frank response. Bureaucrats are rarely so honest when addressing questions of that kind. Now, in the circumstances, it's not surprising that after 2014, much of the population of Crimea, disillusioned with Ukraine, but not sure what the new authorities would be like and what they would do, adopted a rather apathetic wait-and-see attitude. Some actually supported Russia's annexation of Crimea, although it's sometimes hard to distinguish genuine expressions of support from events that were staged by the occupation authorities. So you would have, demonstrations of fervent support for the annexation or occupation annexation. Some of those demonstrations were staged. Some might have been genuine. It's not always easy to tell. As for those who openly opposed the occupation and annexation of Crimea, they were quickly arrested and imprisoned. And I personally know a number of Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, and Russians who were victims of Russia's repressive policies in Crimea in 2014 and later. And I'm getting close to the end of my presentation. Ukraine fortunately learned some lessons from what happened in Crimea and later in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Notably, after 2014, Ukraine belatedly responded to the need for some form of effective decentralization. Kyiv then engaged in low-key but meaningful decentralization reforms throughout Ukraine, and these reforms had quite a significant impact. The increase in the powers of local self-government following decentralization reforms allowed local governments to react quickly to new circumstances in which they found themselves. And many observers argue that this was one of the major sources of the resilience that helped Ukraine deal with the impacts of Russia's invasion in 2022. In other words, after the invasion in February 2022, local officials no longer had to go through a whole chain of command to decide what to do. They had some authority to make decisions on their own in the localities where they were found, and very often they made good decisions about what to do. In any case, to end my presentation, in my opinion, Ukraine will eventually regain control of Crimea. This will probably be a long and difficult process, and no one should underestimate the problems of reintegration that follow. But Ukraine has demonstrated great determination and creativity in dealing with the enormous challenges of what is a devastating war with Russia. I hope that it will demonstrate similar determination and creativity in dealing with the post-war challenges it faces in Crimea and elsewhere. Thank you for your attention.
Alexander is going to talk from the chair.
I'll talk from the chair. Thank you so much. So I obviously lack the deep familiarity that Ivan has of Ukraine and of Crimea in particular. I always learn a lot from his presentations, and so I'm very gratified to share the stage with them. I typically do work with respect to military affairs in Central and Eastern Europe. So obviously the war in Ukraine has been of immense interest to me. And so I'll be speaking mostly in regards to the military or defense aspects of Crimea. And so whereas Ivan gave you the historical and cultural and political context of the present situation surrounding Crimea, I'll probably be speaking much more about the military affairs that now abound. So what I want to do at the beginning is talk through why Crimea doesn't matter from a military perspective. Some of these issues may indeed be familiar to you, especially if you've been following the conflict. I'll then talk about some of the more recent military developments that have been taking place over the course of the last 2 years. I take the perspective that the war began in 2014, but of course, the events since February of last year represent severe military escalation when Crimea suddenly became back into play. As regards to Ukraine. And then I'll be talking about some of the challenges that do lay ahead. I'm perhaps a little more cautious about what the future might bring as regards to whether Ukraine could reassert control over the peninsula. There have been some private murmurings that Ukrainian politicians might in fact be willing to concede or might in fact lessen the importance of bringing back territorial control. But obviously the matter has military value such that it is a target-rich environment for our Ukrainian armed forces all the same, and the threat of liberation remains acute enough that we do observe the Russian ground forces create fortifications all along the northern perimeter of the peninsula. So I'm not entirely sure if it's going to happen, the liberation of Crimea, but Russia is indeed taking that threat seriously enough all the same. And indeed, there's a bit of a disjunction between some of our Western assessments of what's happening presently, especially with regards to the counteroffensive, and even Russian assessments, which are actually very critical of what Russia is doing, how Russia has been faring as of late, pointing out. So why is Crimea important? So I've already mentioned the Black Sea Fleet and how it's headquartered in Sevastopol. It's important precisely because it grants Russia power projection capabilities in the Black Sea. It's a warm water port, so it's available for use year round. It's also has become militarized, as Yvonne had said, since the annexation of Crimea. Militarization has really taken the form of the stationing and development of various air defense assets that would hamper the movement of Ukrainian air assets in and around the region. Because of the Black Sea fleet as well, the Russian Navy can bring assets to bear that can complicate the navigation of Ukrainian or Ukrainian-friendly vessels. And indeed, we saw, even prior to 2022, efforts at spoofing communications, harassment of various these vessels in such a manner that was destabilizing as regards to maritime law in the Black Sea region. What, of course, further complicates this whole issue is that you have Turkey more or less, not more or less, indeed control access to the Black Sea by way of the Bosphorus or Dardanelles, the Bosphorus Straits and Dardanelles through the Montreal Convention. So that limits how much more militarization could indeed take place in the Black Sea, precisely because one requires Turkish permission to sail new military vessels into that body of water. You also have, of course, NATO present on the Black Sea by way of Bulgaria and Romania. However, in part because they were Warsaw kind of countries in the Cold War, in part because these countries are relatively underdeveloped, relatively, I say that with respect to the other European Union countries, they more or less had left their naval assets atrophied. And so the Black Sea fleet de facto was the dominant force, even if the Turkish Navy is present in Turkey now, de facto has the longest coastline in that region. So Crimea is important because you have the Black Sea fleet, you have militarization of that peninsula, which is almost effectively an island, functionally speaking, of course. And as such, you have Russia being able to project a lot of power. And as such, prior to 2022, it seemed that Crimea had been lost for good, and that it would pose immense difficulties for Ukraine to operate within the Black Sea. And indeed, it did encounter difficulties in that goal, not least because of the Kerch Strait incident in 2019 that basically saw the construction of a major land bridge connecting eastern Crimea with that part of Russia down below, closing off the Sea of Azov, which is that body of water that is just due north east of the Black Sea. And so that further limits Ukraine's access to maritime routes, which also limits the sort of power projection capabilities of the Ukraine Navy, which doesn't really have a ship anymore, can bring to bear. So in 2022, we gained a new appreciation for the importance of Crimea because we did see massive military buildup that Russia had undertaken over the course of 2021, beginning in April, but becoming much more serious and obvious in intent come October and November. And indeed, as much as so much of our attention on the 24th of February was concentrated rightly on the axes of attack towards Kyiv from the north, and even in the northeast towards Kyiv, Russia did admittedly score a lot of tactical successes in the south. They were able to push forces from the Crimean Peninsula, taking parts of Kherson Oblast, as well as major swaths of territory in Zaporizhia, connecting eventually Russian territory by way of Ukrainian territory in Luhansk, and most notably, of course, the Donetsk, hugging the coastline around the Sea of Azov. Funny enough, prior to 2021, there were certain war scares that saw apprehension intensify as to whether Russia would try to mount some sort of military attack to create a land bridge connecting that part of Russia near the Sea of Azov with Crimea, in part to resolve certain access difficulties that Russia had had. But those were usually laughed at and oftentimes ridiculed. But that de facto has, in a sense, what has happened. There has been a land bridge that Russia has been able to create, connecting, of course, that territory of Ukraine in that part of its own territory. So because Russia was able to have the most tactical success in that part of Ukraine in the spring of 2022, it was able to fortify its presence and more or less make that very difficult for Ukraine to dislodge. Certainly in the opening months of the so-called special military operation that Russia launched, attention was rightly pointed at the direction of Kyiv, of course, Mariupol, sitting on the Sea of Azov. But unfortunately, Russia did make those military gains that people often overlook at the time. Unfortunately, it seems like it was not so much Russian military brilliance that had scored that particular success. It was effectively Russian intelligence success. That in fact, there may have been defense plans that were compromised and allowed Russian forces to walk in. And indeed, that is a subject of particular controversy to this day. And indeed, I suspect once territory gets liberated, there'll be more and more recriminations about what actually had happened in the south, precisely because Russia's become much more difficult to dislodge. So Crimea was important for pushing out those forces. It was also important for helping to institute a maritime blockade, which in fact preceded the ground invasion. And so really the main axis of attack that probably had the most lasting effect on the contours of the war thus far really did evolve out of the situation in the peninsula. Now, I said that Crimea has been back in play. I think for most of us prior to 2022, Crimea was a bit of a lost cause. There, of course, were initiatives in civil society about taking or liberating Crimea, but those were never really taken too seriously. A lot of them were appealing to the power of international law because Ukraine does have a much more powerful international legal claim to Crimea, not least because of the UN Charter, but also more importantly, the 1997 Treaty of Friendship and Good Neighborliness between Russia and Ukraine, which of course no longer really matters anymore. But what now matters is that because Russia clearly had experienced severe losses, especially those involving its airborne troops, so those elite caliber forces that were largely used in the Battle of Kostiantyn, not far from Kyiv, the airport, in that direction, as well as a large majority of its ground forces that were originally mobilized to invade Ukraine. Russian forces have suffered tremendous attrition. That has led, that has enabled Ukraine to take the fight in a way that few had expected come February. I think the expectation, at least amongst many observers, was that they would not be that resilient as it turned out to be. But because Ukraine turned out to be much more resilient than expected, Ukraine has been able to develop certain capabilities that were denied of it from Western partners, most notably long-range strike capabilities. Ukraine had no long-range strike capabilities prior to last year, in part because NATO partners were very worried about antagonizing Russia, and they saw concerns about destabilizing the situation in Donbass, or they were simply worried about conflict escalation that could ensnare them. And so Ukraine, being deprived of this capability, put upon itself to develop new capabilities, sometimes involving actual missile capabilities, like the Neptune missile, which would be most famously used in the sinking of the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, but also drones that would have the capabilities of flying at least 500 kilometers and hitting targets there. And so, as such, most spectacularly, in August of last year, we saw the Ukrainian armed forces launch a fairly daring attack on airfields in Crimea, the Saki airfield, damaging at least 9 Russian aircraft. And so I think that was aircraft. That was more or less the proof of concept that the fight to retake Crimea was now thinkable in a way that was simply not the case before. Unfortunately, what has happened since August is that Ukraine had to be very busy in liberating a lot of the territory that had lost since February of that year. And so went about two counteroffensives, one in Kherson, the other in Kharkiv. The one in Kharkiv was a rout whereby Ukrainian armed forces were able to liberate large swaths of territory in rapid succession, in part because Russian lines were very thin, and indeed Russia did not really have the manpower to hold on to those lines. That has more or less set expectation for the current counteroffensive, but I think what a lot of people have forgotten already is that the other counteroffensive, the one in Kherson, was much more difficult, much more arduous, and indeed was a very slow paced affair. Did eventually result in the liberation of Kherson City, the most important city so far to be liberated, but it took months and months. And indeed, the lines on the map were moving very, very slowly. So with respect to the current counteroffensive, which I suppose really did begin in the early of June of this year, people have been struck by how slow it seems to be. And the conclusion as such is that it has been unsuccessful, precisely because of the very limited amount of territory that has been liberated thus far. And I think, again, part of the reason why people have those expectations is because they were not paying attention to what had happened in Kherson, where the counteroffensive was slow, but what was happening in Kharkiv. And so there were also mismanaged expectations that drew from potentially a wrong analogy. There were also, of course, those observers in the West who would be extremely dismissive of Russian defensive fortifications and the ability of Russia to defend strong points along the southern axis. And indeed, what we've been finding is that every tree line literally is a battlefield onto its own right, that the progress of territorial liberation is taking place, but it's taking place at a fairly slow pace, precisely because Ukraine is not willing to sacrifice the manpower necessary. That has maybe not necessarily upset, but it has generated some frustration in NATO capitals that the counteroffensive is not proceeding enough, that patience has been wearing thin, but again, Ukrainian lives are the ones at stake. And so they're the better ones to evaluate how to use their manpower, precisely because trained personnel are in relatively short supply, and we do want to do things conservatively. So because the counteroffensive remains in play, and it may very well be taken on the model of Kherson, where the process is much more positional in nature, whereby the point of the tactical decisions made right now is not necessarily to gain territory as much as possible, as quickly as possible, but rather to attrit Russian forces in such a way that eventually the whole Russian military presence in the south would eventually come crashing down, which suggests that the process of liberation may very well be a nonlinear one, and I suspect it is going to be nonlinear, not least because that's what we saw already in either Kherson and Kharkiv. So I feel like before the liberation of Crimea can take place, so much still has to happen. One measure of success for the current counteroffensive is whether Ukrainian armed forces can liberate the city of Bakhmut, which is a military hub in the south that is the linchpin of the Russian military presence there. And it's a logistical hub and has already been under artillery fire, but even so, Russian forces, to their credit, dare I say, were able to move and reinforce positions in Bakhmut, which shows that the ability of Ukraine to interdict Russian military movements is actually very complicated all the same. So if Ukraine were to take Bakhmut, that does not necessarily mean that the counteroffensive will succeed very shortly thereafter, but that will put extraordinary stress on the Russian military presence. They could fall back on other lines, so that might be even closer to Crimea, which indeed would shorten the distance that Ukrainian armed forces would have to cross in order to take the fight to Russian occupying military forces, to say nothing of Crimea itself. So Crimea matters for the counteroffensive insofar as it is the transit point for a lot of military supplies, and that's why we're seeing Ukraine strike targets within Crimea. It's also where there are a number of command and control posts are located. Headquarters of Black Sea Fleet, for instance, had been very recently struck by one of those long-range strike weapons that I mentioned. So those strikes do serve that particular military purpose as regards to the counteroffensive, but they're not necessarily suggestive of a concerted campaign at the moment to retake Crimea. That's not to say that there are no other activities. There have been reports of Ukrainian special operations forces landing within Crimea, killing Russian officers for let's just be honest, and then being able to evacuate. But these are not necessarily actions intended to liberate, but simply to create an atmosphere of unease such that the cost for defending Crimea may be much more higher than Russia had expected. So with all that said, I take the view that we're at this point in the war where we can be cautiously optimistic about how it'll go. I'm fairly optimistic, all things considered, but it is taking time, perhaps even more slowly than even I thought it would take. But again, I'm not privy to the classified information. There's a lot we don't know because of the operational security involved here. And so you have to be a little wary of some of the information that has been coming out. To the extent that there is information coming out that is indicative, I will just note that Russian telegram sources tend to be much more critical of the Russian military effort and defensibility of its positions in southern Ukraine than a lot of Western commentators right now. I think Western commentators have beguiled themselves thinking that the counteroffensive would proceed along the model of the Kyiv offensive, as I mentioned, whereas the, dare I say, Russian telegram soldiers or soldiers on a Russian telegram have a much more intimate sense of what is in fact going on. And there's actually some good news there for Ukrainian voices. But of course, it's not sufficiently abundant in volume as of yet. But again, war is a complicated process. It's non-linear in its trajectory. This could go still many different ways. However optimistic or however we might vary in our optimism as it drives through the progress.
And on that rather grim note, we've hit our time limit, so I'm going to put a line underneath. John, is there anything I need to do? Thanks to the folks who are online. Thanks to everybody coming here today. And many thanks to our two speakers. Thank you.